Components are the bits and pieces that make up our blueprints and can also have functionality or properties attached to them that we can access. In this video, we're going to take a look at where and how we can add components to our blueprints, accessing their properties, and touch on some of the different types of components that are available. Let's go ahead and start working with components inside of a blueprint. So I'm going to create a blueprint by right-clicking in the content browser here and just going to Blueprint Class. And we're going to be using an actor so that we can place it in our level. And I'll just give this a name, static mesh underscore BP. I'm going to double click and open this up. And once we do, we're inside the blueprint editor now on the viewport tab, and we have the ability to start adding components, which we can do from the components panel in the upper left here. So if we click the button for add component, we're going to get a list of all the different types of components that we can access. Now, each of these components have their own properties and functions and data that we can tap into. For example, we have audio, which can be used to play a sound. We have particle effects. We have lights, skeletal meshes and static meshes. We have AI. If you want to give your character AI behaviors, you could use some of these components. They all have built-in functionality. We have different shapes. You could use a camera as like a third-person perspective. You can also use cinematic cameras if you have cinematic that you're setting up. We also have collision volumes, which you'll use quite a bit to prevent characters from walking into things or add collision around an object. You could use a box collision, or you could use it as a trigger, which we'll show you a little bit later in this video as well. But there's all kinds of components. There's so many here, in fact, that we're not going to go through all of these. We'll talk about some more of these, some of the movement ones a little bit here in a moment. But feel free to look through each of the components and the different properties at a later time at your leisure. So for now, all we're going to be using is a static mesh component, which is right here. We could select this from the components list, or we could actually filter if we're looking for something we don't know where it is. We can type it in and filter the list to get a bit of a more narrowed down list based on our entry. So we're going to be using a static mesh here. And as soon as we add it, it's going to ask us to rename this asset. And we're going to show you why you would probably want to do this. If we had multiple static meshes in our project, you're going to see that it just takes the name static mesh and adds numeric value at the end of it, which is not very useful. If we have a list of static meshes, it'd be hard to differentiate them based on this naming convention. So as a best practice, you're probably going to want to rename your static meshes, which you can do by either clicking on the actual name. It'll give you the ability to enter it right here. You can also hit F2 on it. That will also give you the ability. Or over in the details panel, under variable name, you can enter a name for it as well. But I'm going to hold off for doing that just for a second until we assign the actual static mesh that we want to use, which we can do from the details panel down here. So let's go ahead and assign a static mesh, which we can do by clicking this drop down and choosing from the available static meshes that we have in our project. Let's choose this book here. And once we do, we have the ability to assign different materials if we wanted to. There's other properties in here for simulating physics if we want this to be a physics object, collision, lighting, all kinds of different properties related to static meshes. Now that we've assigned our book, I'm going to actually give this a better name from the variable name section here, which we'll just call this book underscore SM for static mesh. Inside the viewport, you can see that we have our book. If you ever get lost, you can press F to focus in on the object that you have selected over in the components list. It'll bring it up. So we have our book inside of here, but we also have this white sphere. So what is that? Let's talk about that for a second. That is what we call the default scene root component. So whenever you create a new blueprint, you're automatically going to have this component added as the default scene root, which you can see here at the top. And we're going to show you what this is for and why it's created initially. So if we compile and save and we close out this blueprint, inside the level here, I'm just going to drag this blueprint into this first stand. I'll just drag it in like so. There's our book. It's quite small right now. But with this object selected, if we look over in the details panel, here is our blueprint, and we can see we have all of the components available that we've added right here in this little component window, including our default scene root and the book. If we were to select the book right now, we could move the book inside the level like so, and you can see it updating in the properties value here. Clicking this option will reset it back to default. If I select the default scene root, that's going to move everything in the blueprint. You may have situations where you have components that you want to offset from their default position. That's how one way that you could do that is by using a scene root, or sometimes we use a scene component or maybe a billboard component. Billboard component is just a 2D sprite that will orientate towards the camera. As you rotate the camera, the light kind of faces the camera, so it makes it easier to select it as an asset inside of the level viewport. Let's go ahead and, for the sake of it, let's just make our book a little bit bigger. There's our first static mesh blueprint. And again, we could add some additional functionality to this. We could change the material, make it a physics asset. If this was 2 static meshes, we could probably have the book open as the player approaches the book. But for now, we're just using a static mesh as our blueprint. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. We're going to create a skeletal mesh. Now we're going to show you a different way that you can add components now to a blueprint. So I'm going to right click and create a new blueprint class. It's going to be of the actor type again. And we'll call this the Skeletal Mesh _BP. And I'm going to double click and open this up. And again, we are inside the blueprint editor. There's our default scene root. I'm just going to dock this to the top here. And you'll notice again that we've opened to the viewport. Whenever you first create a blueprint, it's going to open to the viewport tab. It's expecting you to add components to the blueprint. Once you've opened it or added components, it should open to the event graph where you can start adding your scripted functionality. I just wanted to point that out. Let's go ahead and add some more components here. I'm going to go ahead and click the add button. This time we're adding a skeletal mesh component. Okay, so we're going to add a skeletal mesh component. And I'm going to immediately rename this. We'll just call this character because I know I'm going to be adding a character. Like so. Let's go ahead and do one more thing. We're going to take the skeletal mesh component and we're going to make that the actual root. So instead of having this white sphere as the scene root, we can also make any asset the root as well. So I'm dragging that to the top. And now this is our actual root component. It also gets rid of that little sprite. Let's go ahead and assign our skeletal mesh. We're going to do it a little bit differently than we've done before. If we select the skeletal mesh component and we look in the details panel, now we have different properties that are related to skeletal mesh components, including the ability to assign our skeletal mesh. Now we could click this drop down and select from all the skeletal meshes that we have in our project, similar to what we've done with our static mesh. But we're just going to show you a different way, just so that you know all the different ways that you can do this. And then you can find the way that is most comfortable for you. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the content browser and we're going to filter for all of the skeletal meshes inside of our project. Looks like we have 2. I'm going to select this one here because it looks more like a character. With it selected, if I go back to my blueprint now and the skeletal mesh property, I can click this icon here to use the selected asset from the content browser. So if I click this button, this could be useful if you have 2 windows up and you have something selected in the content browser. You can hop back over and just point directly to it. Another thing that you could do is you could drag a skeletal mesh or any object actually into the components window like so. That will also add components. So another way that you can add components is by dragging and dropping. Again, useful if you have 2 different windows and content browsers up on one and your blueprint's open on another. You can just drag all the components that you need into your blueprint. I'm going to delete that because that's not doing us any good. So I'm going to pop this back up. We have a character in here now. Let's go ahead and change some properties for the skeletal mesh. With it selected over in the details panel, let's go ahead and give it an animation. So I'm going to go to the animation section. Under animation mode, we're going to change it from an animation blueprint to just using an animation asset that we assign. Animation play, we could choose which one we want. This character has some animations in it, so we're just going to choose the idle here, and our character starts idling. We could also set properties like whether it should be looping, if it should be playing at all, initial position, etc. Again, feel free to jump through and look at all the different properties that we have for each of the different components. That's all we're going to do for this blueprint. Short and simple. We're going to compile, save this, close it out. I'm going to clear our filters and go back to our folder with our blueprints in it. And let's go ahead and just drag that in. Now what we should see is once we play inside the editor here, our character is just kind of idling. Now we could add some additional blueprint script to this so that when the player approaches, maybe the character turns and waves at us or does whatever we want. All of that can be done through blueprint script. But for now, we have a simple blueprint with a skeletal mesh component that is animating. Take that a step further. If we look over here, we're using the same skeletal mesh, still animating in an idle position. However, we've added some additional components to this to give it a little bit more functionality. And that's the power of blueprint. So as I approach this character, you're going to see the light comes on above his head. The character kind of starts rotating around. Now this could be useful if you're an animator and you want to look at different animations for a character. We could set our character up on a turntable style setup like this, which allows us to kind of walk around the character and look at the character from different angles as it's rotating around. If we move away, the character stops and a light goes off. So we've done this through Blueprint. And we could extend this even further. We could give our artist friends the ability to switch animations that they're viewing inside the details panel, speed up or slow down the rotation rate, deposit, etc., step through animations, just to kind of view animations for our characters. Again, all doable through the Blueprint visual scripting system. Let's actually take a look at this through animations, just to kind of view animations for our characters. Again, all doable through the Blueprint visual scripting system. Let's actually take a look at this blueprint. We could select it in the level here. We can go to Edit, Blueprint, or we can right click on it and choose Edit as well. That'll bring up the actual blueprint asset. Now again, brought us to the event graph because we already have components and we've already actually done some script here, but I'm going to hop to the viewport just to show you what components we have. We have the skeletal mesh like we had before. We also have a trigger, which is a sphere collision, which we've named trigger, a point light, and we also have this rotating movement component. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to show you that I forgot to show you in the last setup is the ability to establish parent-child relationships with components. So here we have our trigger, here we have our point light. If we were to take our point light and left click and drag it and drop it on top of the trigger, it now becomes a child of the trigger. So whenever we move the actual trigger, the light will move with it. So this is useful if you want to establish parent-child relationships. You can do that just by dragging and dropping. You can undo that just by dragging it off of its parent like so. Just wanted to point that out. So essentially what we're doing with this blueprint is we have a trigger, and what we're saying is when the player enters this volume, take this rotating movement component, set the rotation rate to something like 20 so that our character starts spinning, set it back to 0 so that it doesn't spin. And we're also turning the light on and off as well. So how is this actually working? If we look at the trigger and we go over to the details panel and we scroll down below all the different properties that we can change for that trigger, we have what we call events. So events will fire off blueprint script. And if we look, we have two options that we've already enabled called on component begin overlap and on end overlap. So essentially when we begin overlapping this volume, do some script. When we end overlapping, do some other script. And we can get to those by clicking the view button, which if we go to the event graph, it'll take us right to that node. And here is the script for that blueprint. It's a very simple script. Essentially, as we mentioned, overlapping the volume, setting the rotation rate to 20, turning the visibility of the point light to on, and when we end, setting it back to 0 and turning off the light. And that's our simple script. Now, if we look over in the My Blueprint panel and expand the Components section, all of the components that we've added are going to be available from the Components window. And this gives you the ability to do things like add events for components. So for our rotating movement, we could add some different events. For our point light, we can add some events, trigger, and our mannequin. Let's go ahead and compile and save this and close it out. And that is a blueprint with multiple components. We've learned that there are different types of components and that we can add them to our blueprints. We also ran through the different ways in which you can add components to blueprints, adjusted some of the different properties, and talked about how you can use events to fire off some blueprint script. If you need to, take some time and continue looking at the different types of components available and their properties, as having a solid understanding of how components work is a key concept in blueprint visual scripting.